Your Honor, she's a drug dealer. I found the evidence myself, and my word should be enough. The courtroom fell into the kind of silence where you could hear the scratch of a pen against paper, the faint rustle of fabric as someone shifted uncomfortably in the gallery, the barely audible hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, casting everything in that cold, institutional glow that made even the innocent look guilty. From the witness stand, Deputy Kyle Brennan leaned forward with a smirk that didn't quite reach his pale blue eyes, his sun-bleached platinum blonde hair catching the light in a way that made him look almost angelic, almost righteous, like every small-town recruitment poster come to life. Broad shoulders mirrored aviators hooked on his uniform collar and the kind of confidence that only comes from a man who has never, not once in his entire career, been told he was wrong. He pointed directly at the woman sitting in the defendant's chair, her hands folded neatly on the scratched wooden table in front of her, her posture so still it was almost unnerving, like she was carved from stone rather than flesh and bone. "I know a drug dealer when I see one," Brennan scoffed, his voice dripping with the kind of casual contempt that comes from years of unchecked authority, from knowing that his badge carried more weight than anyone else's truth. "And this woman is exactly the type an outsider, someone who comes into our county thinking she can live off the system, thinking our laws don't apply to her kind." The defendant, Iris Elaine Spencer, said. Nothing in response. Didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't even blink. She just sat there with that same calm, predatory patience. Her skin a deep, radiant shade of onyx that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights like polished stone. A striking, almost defiant contrast against the cheap neon orange of her county-issued jumpsuit. She watched Brennan the way a chess master watches an opponent who doesn't realize the game ended 3 moves ago, the way a lioness watches prey that's already stepped into the trap, unaware that every word he spoke was another nail in a coffin he was building for himself. Brennan thought he was destroying a nobody, dismantling the life of some insignificant woman who had no power, no voice, no chance against the weight of his badge and his reputation. He had no idea, absolutely no idea, that he was currently reading his own professional obituary aloud, word by damning word, in front of a room full of witnesses who would soon watch him fall. Whitmore County looked like something pulled straight from a postcard. The kind of place tourists drive through on their way to somewhere more important, and think, how charming, without ever stopping long enough to see what's really underneath. Flat farmland stretching out to the horizon in every direction, white-steepled churches anchoring every corner like moral landmarks. Friday night football games where the entire town gathered under buzzing stadium lights to cheer for boys who carried the weight of community pride on their 17-year-old shoulders. But beneath that surface, beneath the carefully maintained veneer of small-town wholesomeness, something had been rotting for a long, long time, festering in the silence, spreading through the cracks that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Over the past 5 years, 23 formal complaints had been filed against Brennan's unit, most of them from Black and Latino drivers who described eerily similar experiences being pulled over for minor infractions, or no reason at all being subjected to aggressive searches that turned up nothing being spoken to with a level of disrespect and hostility that felt personal, targeted, deliberate. 23 times, the department launched what they called an investigation, which mostly involved the sheriff asking Brennan and his partners what happened, accepting their version of events without question, and filing the complaint away in a drawer that might as well have been labeled unfounded and forgotten. 23 times, the result was exactly the same unfounded case-closed move along nothing to see here. Sheriff Wayne Decker signed every single dismissal without so much as glancing at the details. His signature a lazy scrawl across the bottom of each report, a rubber stamp of institutional indifference that told victims exactly how much their complaints mattered, which was not at all. The system wasn't broken, not in the way people usually mean when they say something's broken. It wasn't malfunctioning or failing to operate as designed. No, the system was working perfectly, functioning exactly as it was built to function, a well-oiled machine designed to protect its own, to shield officers like Brennan from accountability, to ensure that the people with badges always had the final word, always got the benefit of the doubt, always walked away unscathed, while the people they targeted carried the weight of false accusations, criminal records, and shattered trust in institutions that were supposed to serve them. But 1,200 miles away, in a secure office within the FBI's Civil Rights Division, analysts were tracking the anomalies, the statistical patterns that didn't quite add up, the disproportionate number of drug arrests in a county with no corresponding drug problem, the complaints that kept appearing and disappearing like ghosts in a system designed to make them vanish. They needed someone who could blend in, someone who understood what it meant to be black in a town not built for them. Someone who could endure the humiliation, the danger, the isolation of going undercover in a place where the color of your skin made you a target before you even opened your mouth. They needed someone with nerves of steel, a mind sharp enough to remember every detail without writing anything down, and a willingness to let themselves be arrested, jailed, humiliated, all in service of exposing a truth that had been buried for far too long. They chose Iris Elaine Spencer, a 12-year veteran of the Bureau and a specialist in police misconduct investigations, a woman who had built her career dismantling corrupt departments from the inside out, who knew how to play the long game, who understood that sometimes justice requires you to become invisible so the truth can finally be seen. In June 2023, Iris Spencer disappeared from her real life and became someone else entirely, someone smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, a ghost walking through Whitmore County with a fabricated past and a carefully constructed present designed to make her exactly the kind of person Deputy Brennan loved to target. She rented a small, rundown apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place where the carpet was permanently stained and the windows didn't quite close all the way, where the neighbors kept to themselves and nobody asked questions because everyone had something they didn't want asked about. She drove a dented Honda Accord with a cracked taillight and a bumper sticker peeling at the corners. The kind of car that screamed easy mark to any officer looking to pad their arrest numbers. Everything about her new life was a prop meticulously designed to withstand scrutiny while revealing nothing real. She hung her niece's crayon drawings on the refrigerator, colorful stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. The kind of innocent art that suggested family ties, normalcy, someone with people who cared about her. She wore a cheap pendant around her neck, the kind you'd find at a gas station checkout counter. Nothing expensive, nothing that would make anyone think she had money or connections or anything worth protecting. She shopped at the local grocery store, nodded politely to strangers, kept her head down, blended into the background noise of small-town life, waiting for the moment when Deputy Kyle Brennan would notice her, the way he'd noticed 23 others before her. The FBI's technical team had done their work invisibly brilliantly, installing a molecular-level sensor in the pendant she wore every day, a device so small and so sophisticated it could record audio in crystal-clear quality without any visible hardware, without any telltale blinking lights or suspicious bulges. They'd also embedded a secondary high-definition lens in the rearview mirror of her Honda, positioned at an angle that would capture both the driver's seat and the front passenger area, a dual-angle feed that would show not just what happened, but exactly how it happened, leaving no room for interpretation, no room for lies, no room for the kind of he said, she said ambiguity that had protected officers like Brennan for years. Iris didn't know exactly when Brennan would make his move, but she knew he would because men like him always did. They were drawn to perceived vulnerability, the way sharks are drawn to blood in the water, operating on instinct and prejudice, convinced of their own invincibility, never once considering that the person they were targeting might be stronger, smarter, more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. So she drove carefully, followed every traffic law down to the letter, kept her hands visible, her demeanor calm, and waited for the inevitable moment when Brennan's pattern would intersect with her carefully laid trap, when the machine that had protected him for so long would finally, catastrophically break down. September 14th, just after sunset, the sky fading from orange to deep purple, the air cooling after another scorching day. Iris was driving 43 miles per hour in a 45 zone, her mahogany hands positioned precisely at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, her posture relaxed but alert. Her eyes flicking periodically to the rearview mirror where she could see the patrol car sitting in the gravel turnout like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. She saw the blue lights flash before she heard the siren, that distinctive whoop-whoop that makes every driver's heart skip a beat regardless of whether they've done anything wrong. And she pulled over smoothly, signaling properly, parking on the shoulder with her hazard lights on, doing everything by the book, because she absolutely knew that none of it would matter, that Brennan had already decided her guilt before he even turned on his lights. She placed her hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, fingers spread slightly, posture open and non-threatening. Every movement deliberate and visible, because she'd been trained to survive encounters exactly like this one, trained to recognize the signs of an officer looking for any excuse to escalate. "License and registration," Brennan barked as he approached her window, his flashlight aimed directly at her face, blinding her intentionally. A power move designed to disorient and intimidate, to establish from the very first second that he was in control, and she was not. "Good evening, officer," Iris replied, her voice calm and measured, smooth as polished onyx. Not a hint of fear or defiance, just neutral professionalism, the kind of tone that should have de-escalated the situation, but instead seemed to irritate Brennan even more. "May I ask why I was pulled over? I believe I was driving under the speed limit and followed all traffic laws." Brennan didn't answer her question, didn't even pretend to have a legitimate reason. He just leaned closer to her window. His face twisted into something between a sneer and a smile, and said the words he'd practiced 23 times before, the same script that had worked every single time without fail. "I smell marijuana coming from this vehicle. Step out of the car. Now." It was a lie, an obvious brazen lie, and they both knew it, but knowing didn't matter because his word carried the weight of law, and hers carried nothing at all. He forced her out of the car with his hand hovering near his weapon, not quite threatening, but not quite friendly either, walking that careful line between aggressive policing and outright assault. And then he began tearing through her car with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he was looking for something specific, something he knew he'd find because he'd brought it with him. His partner, Deputy Megan Holt, stood off to the side near the patrol car, her own body camera conveniently switched off a technical malfunction. She'd say later equipment failure. These things happen, watching with a carefully blank expression that suggested she'd seen this performance before and knew exactly how it would end. And then with a practiced flick of the wrist so smooth it was almost elegant, Brennan reached into his own pocket, pulled out a small Ziploc bag containing white powder, and with theatrical surprise discovered it wedged under the passenger seat, holding it up triumphantly like a hunter displaying a trophy kill. He walked Iris to his patrol car, his grip on her arm just tight enough to leave marks tight enough to remind her who had the power here, and as he pushed her head down to guide her into the back seat. Unnecessary force disguised as procedure. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear, and whispered words that she would never forget. Words that would later be played in a federal courtroom for all to hear. "In Whitmore County, I am the law," he said, his voice thick with smug certainty, with absolute conviction in his own untouchability. "You're going away for a long time, sweetheart, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." Iris sat in a concrete cell for 3 days, 72 hours that stretched and compressed simultaneously, time becoming something fluid and unreliable in the fluorescent hum of institutional confinement, in the endless cycle of harsh lights that never dimmed, never softened, never gave her the mercy of darkness or privacy, or even the simple comfort of knowing what time it was, whether it was day or night, whether anyone outside these walls knew where she was or cared that she'd disappeared. The first night she counted the cinder blocks in her cell 47 across 29 high, because counting gave her something to focus on, a way to keep her mind sharp and occupied, a defense against the creeping despair that came with being caged like an animal, stripped of dignity, reduced to a number and an orange jumpsuit, and a bed that was barely more than a concrete slab with a thin, stained mattress. The second night, she listened to a woman 2 cells down sobbing for her children. Her voice raw and broken, crying out names that went unanswered, and Iris thought about all the other people who had sat in these same cells. Innocent people caught in the same trap. People without the resources or the training or the institutional backing to fight back. People who would take plea deals they didn't deserve because fighting meant risking everything and losing anyway. She thought about her own family, her husband who believed she was on assignment in another state, her sister who thought she was unreachable due to operational security, her niece whose drawings hung on a refrigerator in an apartment that wasn't really hers, and she felt the weight of their absence like a physical thing pressing down on her chest. The third night, Brennan came by just to watch her through the bars, his arms folded across his chest. That same infuriating smirk plastered across his face like he'd already won the game, already secured the victory, already added her to his list of successful arrests and moved on to thinking about his next target. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in silence, his presence alone, a message that he wanted her to understand clearly. This is your life now, this cage, this helplessness, this complete and total loss of control, and you'd better get used to it because it's not changing, not ever. Not for someone like you. You know what I love about this county? He finally said, his voice casual, conversational, like they were old friends, catching up over coffee rather than a corrupt cop gloating over his victim. People like you, outsiders, troublemakers, people who come here thinking they're special, thinking they're somehow different from all the others, you always learn the same lesson eventually. You're not special. You're just another file number, another conviction on my record. Another name I won't remember in 6 months. And when you get out in 10, 15 years, assuming you even survive that long in a women's facility, I'll still be here wearing this badge doing exactly what I do best, and there won't be a damn thing you can do about it, because nobody cares what happens to people like you. Iris looked up at him, then meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd shoved her into this cell. And when she spoke, her voice was so quiet, he had to lean closer to hear her. So calm, it was almost unsettling, like she knew something he didn't like. She was privy to information that would change everything. You said, people like me? She repeated, her tone neutral, giving nothing away. No anger, no fear, just simple observation. Brennan's smirk widened, thinking she was playing into his hands, giving him exactly what he wanted. Yeah. People who don't belong here, people who need to be reminded of their place. People who... I'll remember. You said that, Iris interrupted softly, still not breaking eye contact, still wearing that same unnerving calm like armor. I'll remember every word. He laughed then, a sharp, dismissive bark of amusement that echoed off the concrete walls, and walked away still chuckling, still completely convinced of his own invincibility. What Brennan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that while he stood there gloating, while he delivered his little speech about power and permanence and people knowing their place, the FBI's technical team was finishing their analysis of the footage from the rearview mirror camera, from the pendant microphone, from the backup files that Deputy Holt thought she'd deleted, but had actually been auto-archived to a cloud server she didn't even know existed. They had everything. The traffic stop, the planted evidence, the whispered threats, all of it captured in crystal-clear audio and high-definition video from multiple angles, leaving absolutely no room for interpretation or denial. Iris made her one phone call on the morning of the 4th day, dialing a secure DC line that connected directly to her supervising agent, and when he answered, she whispered just 2 words that would set everything in motion. Package received. October 23rd. The trial, The courtroom packed with local spectators who came because small towns don't get much in the way of entertainment, and a drug trial involving an outsider was about as exciting as things got around here, with curious neighbors and courthouse regulars filling the gallery, whispering speculation about the woman in the orange jumpsuit who sat so still and quiet, who looked like she didn't belong in a place like this, who seemed almost too composed for someone facing serious prison time. Deputy Kyle Brennan took the witness stand and placed his hand on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help him God. The irony apparently lost on him as he prepared to deliver a performance he'd rehearsed so many times, it probably felt more real to him than the actual events. Lie number 1. She was driving erratically, swerving between lanes, making unsafe movements that suggested impairment or distraction. Lie number 2. The vehicle smelled strongly of marijuana, an odor I recognized immediately from my years of experience in narcotics enforcement. Lie number 3. When I approached the vehicle, the defendant became hostile and verbally abusive, using profanity and refusing to cooperate with lawful orders. Lie number 4. The drugs were in plain view, partially visible under the passenger seat, which gave me probable cause to conduct a search without needing a warrant or her consent. Each lie came smoothly, confidently delivered with the practiced ease of someone who'd told these same stories before and been believed every single time without question. Someone who knew that juries trusted badges more than defendants, that judges deferred to officers who claimed they were just doing their jobs, that the system was built to accept his version of reality over anyone else's. Public Defender Raymond Brooks stood up slowly, and if you'd seen him a week ago, you would have recognized him as the same tired, overworked attorney who handled dozens of cases simultaneously, who barely had time to learn his clients' names before shuffling them toward plea deals, because that was the only realistic option in a system designed to churn through defendants like widgets on an assembly line. But something had changed. His posture was different, straighter, more confident, and his eyes held a gleam that suggested he knew something nobody else in the room knew, something that was about to change everything. Deputy Brennan Brooks began, his voice carrying a weight that made several people in the gallery sit up a little straighter. Pay a little more attention. You testified under oath that no recording of this traffic stop exists because of an equipment failure. Is that correct? Brennan nodded, still wearing that same smirk, still completely at ease. That's correct. Body camera malfunction happens sometimes with older equipment. We've got the maintenance records to prove it. Brooks nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation carefully, and then he smiled, not a friendly smile, not a sympathetic smile, but the kind of smile a chess player wears when they're about to announce checkmate. Then, how, Deputy, do you explain this? The screen mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life, and the gallery collectively gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like wind rushing through trees before a storm. Because there on the screen, in perfect high-definition clarity, was Deputy Kyle Brennan standing beside Iris Spencer's Honda Accord, his hand reaching into his own pocket, pulling out a small Ziploc bag, and then, clear as day, undeniable damning, slipping it under the passenger seat before stepping back and discovering it moments later with theatrical surprise. The smirk melted off Brennan's face like ice in summer heat. The courtroom erupted into chaos, not the loud, disorderly kind of chaos, but something quieter and somehow more devastating. The collective sound of people gasping, murmuring, shifting in their seats as they processed what they were seeing, as the carefully constructed narrative they'd been fed collapsed in on itself, like a building with its foundation removed. An elderly black woman in the third row covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide and shining with tears that could have been relief or vindication, or just the overwhelming weight of finally seeing proof of something she'd always known but could never prove. A young Latino man gripped his wife's shoulder, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles jumping, because he'd been pulled over by Brennan 2 years ago had been searched and humiliated and released without charges, but with the lingering suspicion that maybe, just maybe, if things had gone differently, he could have ended up exactly where Iris was now. In the back of the courtroom, Deputy Megan Holt sat frozen, her face drained of all color, her hands gripping the edge of the bench so hard her fingers hurt, because she'd deleted the body camera footage, or at least she thought she had, thought she'd covered her tracks, thought the cloud backup system was just for administrative record-keeping and didn't actually archive deleted files the way the IT department had warned everyone it would. But now, sitting here watching her career implode in real time, she realized something far worse than just losing her job. She'd had a choice. 23 times. She'd had a choice, 23 opportunities to speak up, to report what she saw, to refuse to participate in this pattern of abuse and corruption. And 23 times she'd chosen silence, chosen complicity, chosen to look the other way because it was easier, because it was safer, because standing up to Brennan meant becoming a target herself. Your Honor, Raymond Brooks announced, his voice ringing through the courtroom with crystal clarity, cutting through the murmurs and gasps and shocked whispers, commanding attention in a way that transformed him from an overworked public defender into something more powerful, something that looked an awful lot like justice finally arriving after being delayed for far too long. My client is not an insurance clerk, not a drifter, not some random woman caught with drugs in her car. She is Special Agent in Charge, Iris Elaine Spencer, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division, and she has been operating undercover in Whitmore County for the past 4 months as part of a federal investigation into patterns of misconduct, evidence planting, and civil rights violations within the Sheriff's Department. The silence that followed was absolute total. The kind of silence that happens when an entire room holds its breath simultaneously, when shock is so complete that even the basic functions of human existence, breathing, blinking, moving, seem to pause in recognition of a moment that changes everything. The air felt different somehow, charged with electricity, with the crackling energy of a truth so massive it seemed to bend reality around it, reshaping the narrative, rewriting the story, transforming the victim into the victor and the victor into the accused. Iris stood slowly, gracefully, shedding the passive demeanor she'd maintained throughout the proceedings, like a snake shedding old skin, and when she reached into the clear plastic bag containing her personal property, her movements were deliberate, ceremonial, weighted with significance. She pulled out a heavy gold and silver federal shield, the kind that catches light and throws it back in sharp, authoritative gleams, the kind that represents power far beyond anything Deputy Kyle Brennan had ever wielded, the kind that meant every word he'd spoken, every lie he'd told, every threat he'd whispered in that jail cell was now documented evidence in a federal case that would destroy not just him, but the entire corrupt structure that had protected him for so long. She looked directly at Brennan, who sat motionless in the witness box, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track: shock, disbelief, fear, and finally a kind of numb resignation that came from realizing that everything he'd built, everything he'd taken for granted was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You said your word was the Bible in this county. Deputy, Iris said, her voice like velvet wrapped around steel, smooth and beautiful but absolutely unbreakable, carrying the weight of 12 years of training, of dozens of successful investigations, of a career built on dismantling men exactly like him. But today, the truth is the only thing on the record. And the truth says you're a liar. A corrupt officer who planted evidence, who violated civil rights, who abused the power entrusted to you, and who is going to face consequences for every single one of those actions. She turned then, not to face him anymore, but to address the gallery, the judge, the entire system that had enabled this pattern to continue for so long unchecked. 23 complaints were filed against Deputy Brennan's unit over the past 5 years. 23 times victims came forward seeking justice and were turned away, dismissed, told their experiences didn't matter. Today that changes. Today, every one of those cases gets reviewed, re-examined, and where evidence supports it, overturned. The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, not shock, but reverence. The kind of quiet that falls when people witness something significant, something that matters, something they'll tell their grandchildren about years from now. The sheriff's department didn't just break it. Imploded from within, collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, like a building that had been rotting from the inside for years, finally succumbing to structural failure when someone pulled the load-bearing beam that had been holding everything together through sheer willful ignorance and institutional protection. Within hours of the courtroom revelation, 40 federal agents swarmed the precinct in coordinated teams, arriving in unmarked vehicles wearing windbreakers with bright yellow FBI letters across the back, carrying boxes and evidence bags and the kind of methodical efficiency that comes from executing a warrant they'd been preparing for months. Every file was seized: personnel records, arrest reports, internal affairs investigations, evidence logs, body camera footage that officers thought had been deleted emails between deputies discussing traffic stops and quotas, and which neighborhoods made for easy targets. Budget documents showing how the department's funding increased based on seizure revenue, creating a perverse incentive to maximize arrests regardless of actual guilt. Sheriff Wayne Decker stood in his office doorway watching the systematic dismantling of everything he'd overseen for the past 12 years, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone, but finding no one left to call because the county commissioners had already issued a statement distancing themselves from any knowledge of misconduct. The mayor's office had gone completely silent, refusing to return calls or issue comments, and the FBI wasn't interested in his explanations or his excuses because they had evidence, mountains of it, and evidence didn't negotiate or make deals or accept promises of reform. Deputy Kyle Brennan was led out of the courthouse in the same handcuffs he'd used on Iris Spencer just weeks earlier, the metal bracelets clicking shut around his wrists with a finality that seemed to echo through the building, and as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. His face had transformed from the smug confidence of a man who thought himself untouchable into something hollow and defeated, the look of someone realizing too late that the game he'd been playing had rules he didn't understand and consequences he'd never seriously considered. He would eventually be sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, a number that felt both impossibly large and somehow insufficient, given the damage he'd caused, the lives he'd destroyed, the trust he'd violated. Within 6 months, 23 convictions were vacated after thorough review by federal prosecutors working with civil rights attorneys. 23 people who had been branded as criminals, who carried the weight of felony records, who lost jobs and housing and custody of children, who were told by the system that their version of events didn't matter as much as a deputy's word finally hearing judges announce that the evidence against them had been compromised, that their constitutional rights had been violated, that they were free to go with records expunged and apologies that could never fully repair the damage, but at least acknowledged it. 11 of those people had been serving active sentences, some in county jail, some transferred to state facilities, and they went home to their families. Walked out of courthouses as free citizens held children who had grown taller in their absence, tried to piece together lives that had been interrupted by a lie. Deputy Megan Holt negotiated a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Brennan and cooperation with the federal investigation, agreeing to a suspension of her law enforcement certification and probation rather than prison time. A deal that felt like mercy to her and like injustice to the people she'd watched Brennan victimize without ever speaking up. But prosecutors determined that her cooperation was valuable enough to warrant leniency, that sometimes you have to make difficult compromises to dismantle larger structures of abuse. She would spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of those 23 moments when she chose silence. 23 chances to be brave that she let slip through her fingers because it was easier to look away, because protecting herself felt more important than protecting strangers, because she told herself that one person couldn't change a system this entrenched. Iris Elaine Spencer walked out of the Whitmore County Courthouse on a crisp October afternoon, the kind of day where the air smells like fallen leaves and possibilities, where the light hits everything at an angle that makes the world look softer, kinder, more forgiving than it actually is. And as she descended the courthouse steps in her own clothes, a tailored navy suit that fit her properly, that made her look like exactly who she was, rather than who she'd been pretending to be. Her onyx skin seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, radiant with the kind of beauty that comes not from cosmetics or youth, but from dignity, reclaimed from justice finally, belatedly, reluctantly delivered. She didn't look back at the building behind her, didn't pause to savor the moment or deliver a statement to the handful of reporters who had gathered, hoping for a quote, because this wasn't about personal vindication or individual triumph. This was about the 23 people who came before her, who filed complaints that were dismissed, who told the truth and weren't believed, who suffered in silence because the system designed to protect them had instead protected the people who hurt them. This was about the 11 people who were going home to their families tonight, because she'd been willing to endure 3 days in a cell, willing to let herself be humiliated and threatened and caged like an animal, willing to play the long game even when the short-term cost felt unbearable. She didn't look back at the postcards, the white steeples, the flat farmland, the Friday night football games where people gathered to cheer for something pure and simple and uncomplicated, because those things had always been a facade, a pretty lie that covered up ugly truths, and she'd never been interested in facades, only in what lies beneath them in the rot that grows when nobody's willing to shine a light into dark corners. As she reached her car, not the dented Honda Accord with the cracked taillight, but her actual vehicle, a sleek sedan with government plates, she paused for just a moment, her hand on the door handle, thinking about Deputy Brennan in his cell experiencing for the first time what it felt like to be caged, to be powerless, to have his word mean nothing against the weight of evidence. Justice had been delayed, ignored, dismissed, buried under procedural excuses and institutional indifference. But because one woman was willing to sit in the dark and let the 6 months later the Whitmore County Sheriff's Department no longer existed in the form it once had dismantled and rebuilt under a federal consent decree that mandated body cameras on every officer with footage automatically uploaded to servers beyond local control, civilian oversight boards with actual power to investigate and discipline, rather than just rubber stamp official versions of events and quarterly audits by the Department of Justice, to ensure compliance wasn't just performed for show, but embedded into daily operations. The postcards and white steeples remained, but the machine beneath them had been taken apart piece by rusted piece and reassembled into something that at least had the potential to function as it was supposed to protect rather than prey upon the vulnerable. Iris returned to D.C. and to her real life, to her husband and her niece and her actual apartment, where the drawings on the refrigerator were genuine rather than props. But she never forgot those 3 days in the concrete cell. The cold seeping into her bones, the isolation pressing down like physical weight, the way Brennan's smirk burned itself into her memory as a reminder that evil often wears a badge and a smile and operates with the blessing of institutions too comfortable to question their own practices. She kept the cheap pendant in a small wooden box on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes justice requires you to become invisible, so the truth can finally be seen that courage isn't always loud and dramatic, but sometimes quiet and patient and willing to endure indignity in service of something larger. And in Whitmore County, 11 families sat down to dinner together again, no longer haunted by the weight of false convictions, their children asking fewer questions now. Not because they understood everything that had happened, but because the adults had finally started telling the truth, because the system that had failed them so spectacularly was being held accountable because someone had cared enough to fight back even when fighting meant suffering first. From the other side of silence comes truth, Like, subscribe to our channel, and share this story because silence protects the guilty, but attention changes everything.